One of the things that I really like about the Elder Scrolls universe, I don't like a lot about the Elder Scrolls universe, but there's one thing that they've done over its entire history that I think is genius, and that is that they have conflicting narratives of historical events as like books and things that you can read and find throughout the game. So there's a lot of stuff, if you like pull up the wiki, where it will be like, here's two conflicting narratives on this thing that maybe it might have happened, we're not sure. And it's like, it makes the world feel more real, in my opinion. It's one of the things that I've really liked about that. Also, one of the things that I've really liked about Dragon Age is that Dragon Age has like all of this lore and like what happened, but then at the end of Dragon Age Inquisition, you basically find out all of that is bullshit.
Well, the entire premise of Dragon Age 2 is that it's told through the lens of an unreliable narrator, which is an excellent way to frame that entire game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so cool. Like I think
I'm playing through Inquisition again.
Welcome, everybody, to the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan. We've got a great show lined up for me today with two amazing guest hosts. I don't know why I can't say that properly. Joining me from the... I can't say... That state up north. It's my good friend, James, otherwise known as Squirrel Mob. How are you doing today, James?
I'm doing all right. It's in typical Michigan fashion. Today it's 70. Tomorrow it's supposed to snow.
Yeah, what the fuck?
Okay.
Yep. It's one of the things I think is weird. Also joining us, by the way, all the way out from Las Vegas, where it's definitely not that weather, is Sage.
It is 70 degrees. Very lovely.
So Nebraska is going through a similar situation as you, James, because it was like 90. I'm not joking you. It was 90 Thursday and Friday. Then Friday night we had a thunderstorm, and now it's 32 degrees.
Wow.
And it's like my knee hurts so bad.
You've entered the wizened elder stage of your life.
Shit.
You can tell the weather by your knee.
My knee. It's like, well, okay, so I think I've talked about this before. It's like my knee. I screwed up my knee playing football in high school.
As one does.
So anytime the weather changes, I can like feel it coming.
That barometric pressure drop or like rise. Oh yeah, I'm the same fucking way.
Oh my gosh. And then
sinuses.
Sinuses, I'm sure, is the worst. But yeah, dropping 60 degrees in a day, my knee was just like, hey, what if we just didn't?
Yeah, we're supposed to get those storms today and tonight, and we hit, 80s. We had record high temperatures on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Yeah. It was like 81, 83, 84, which like doesn't happen in April very often, but probably will start happening more. That seems to be the way things are going.
And then Vegas never gets hot, right, Sage?
Yeah, not once.
Yeah, it's just a cool 70 degrees all
the time.
All the time. You're not living in a desert. I don't, But thank you all for joining us. If you like this show, want to support us, be sure to go check out our merch store. One thing you can get over there is our Mind Sculptors hoodie, which I did have on, but then I was hot, so I took it off. I
gotta get one.
You can also get our Is This a Nagila card, or could be a Nagila card merch. So make sure to head over there and pick that up at themindsculptors.com/shop. Also, we are sponsored by Dragon Shield. We've got these matte dual sleeves here. These are their dual matte sleeves that they sent me.
Oh, they're honestly my favorite.
They're really good. I'm a big fan. And so I still use my petrol mats. As soon as they make petrol dual mats, I'll make the switch. But petrol mats, I just have so many petrol mats that it's just too much work to not sleeve them in that. But if you want a good set of these, one of the things that's really cool about these, I'm going to open this here real quick while we're here, is that they are opaque. And one of the things that's nice about that is that means the interior here is black.
It looks so
they don't
clean.
See through. So let me, for example, show you this beautiful Vorinclex that I opened on Friday night. It has this back here, right? In some sleeves, you would be able to see on the back, but in this, you have this beautiful black backdrop. And then means you can't see it on the back, which means you aren't going to get flagged at deck checks, which is a big, big plus. So you can go to the link down in the description, use our affiliate link to help support the channel. Also, you can support us on patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors. Every little bit helps. Helps me be able to do the show and continue to bring quality cEDH content to the masses on a weekly basis. Today, we are talking about, so a few weeks ago, Phoenix and I, to get back into the swing of things, did an episode of cards you should be playing or, underrated cards, things like that. Today, we're talking about staples that maybe you shouldn't be playing. And so we kind of put together a list here of some cards that are a little bit of indicative of sort of what we're talking about with certain particular types of cards. Not all of us agree on all of these, which is fine. But that is one of the things here that we're going to be talking about. The first card that we'll talk about today is Professional Facebreaker. If you're unfamiliar with Professional Facebreaker, it's a 2 colorless and a red 2/3 human warrior creature with menace. It says whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. You can sacrifice a treasure, exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card this turn. So, Sage, you were the one who suggested this card as a card that you think is James. Oh, excuse me. James was.
Yes.
James, you were one of the people who suggested this card. You were one of us who suggested this. And I tend to agree with you. Like, I don't play this in all of my red decks. What is your thoughts on why too many people are playing?
So it kind of boils down to two things on this. The first one has to do with its mana cost. Yes, it's only 3. Yes, it's only 2 in a red. But at 3 mana, you have a lot of other cards that kind of overlap with what makes Facebreaker good, where you would rather play that 3-drop. And most notably, it's Tymna, right? Mm-hmm. You would much rather play Tymna on 3 than Professional Facebreaker. And if you're playing Tymna on 3, like Facebreaker on 4 is fine, but it feels like a card where when you have enough of a board presence that you're actually generating enough treasures to do much, it's kind of too late. And if you get it down too early, you don't have the board presence to actually be getting your treasures. You might get 1 a turn, which isn't bad, but like you get 1 a turn from Ragavan, and Ragavan also gives you potential card advantage, and it's a 1-drop, which is kind of more Ragavan's problem because it's busted, but Facebreaker, compared to other creatures that do things when you attack and hit with them, feels underwhelming, despite the fact that it's really good, right? I mean, we could joke about, is this a Najeela card? Like, this seems like it's...
Oh, yeah. Like, this
it's a warrior.
Like, it's a combo piece, right?
It doesn't quite win with Najeela, but it gets real close.
Yeah. The other problem with it is kind of that similar piece where a lot of the creatures that decks are playing right now have really good abilities, and you don't want to lose them in combat. And if you're trying to press an advantage with Professional Facebreaker, you run that risk of losing your 2/2 Grand Abolisher or whatever. Like most of the creatures you're playing, weirdly enough, aren't that good to attack with. Like you've got a few decks running 1 or 2 creatures that are in there as more or less pure attackers, but that's not enough to really get the value out of this. And if you're playing a deck that has that wide a swath of creatures, you're probably playing a stack space deck where those treasures probably are not actually benefiting you at all.
I would actually say that a card like Grim Hireling is, if you're looking for this type of effect, Grim Hireling, I think is just much better. I think,
I'd much rather.
And it's
I
also
think,
removal, which is like legit.
Exactly.
Yeah, which makes it also easier to beat in.
I've never seen the second ability of this card ever be a useful piece.
It's always a Hail Mary.
Yeah, like
it is always I have blown everything else I do. I now need to like swing for that.
Yeah.
And that's not to say there aren't decks where this like should be in it. Like that second ability probably means that this should be in Prosper. Like there's probably other decks where Professional Facebreaker is going to be good enough.
Yeah.
There might be like, say, a Gruul deck where you don't have a whole lot of card advantage. Like you might run this anyways because you're probably running creatures and getting that card advantage helps. But a lot of the decks running it, it seems underwhelming compared to anything else you could be playing, like more interaction, for example.
Why would I run more interaction, James? I don't need more
I don't know. Maybe because you're tired of other people winning the game very quickly.
I don't know what you're talking about. My games go really long.
It seems to be a complaint I hear frequently, and then people have like a copy of Swords to Plowshares in the deck.
I would like to say I do think that like Professional Facebreaker in the like Tymna Crom decks makes sense. You have a lot of evasive creatures that are going to be able to get through. Tymna provides
one of them being your commander, of course.
Yeah, Crom can get through. Tymna can get through. And so, like, I think it is good. I do think I like Grim Hireling more. And if you're competing for spots, I play Grim Hireling before I would play.
See, that competition is actually, I think, where Facebreaker falls a little flat, even in like Tymna Crom decks, is that when you have, like, on a 3-color deck, it's probably going to cut mustard. It might be good enough there. But when you start pushing 4 colors, there's so many other options you have that it probably just isn't actually going to be good enough. Like, even if you have things like Crom that's evasive, or you're playing something like, what's the new March Machine Fairy Mastermind?
Yeah.
Like a bunch of people are, experimenting with that. Like, even if you have little dudes like that are evasive, I think there are so many better options when you have access to 4 or 5 colors that it's gonna feel not good enough in those types of decks frequently.
Yeah, it's hard, especially because the red is the impulse draw, and when you have access to just regular straight up draw, like why would you not just have that instead so that you could hang on to your options? I think for Professional Facebreaker, I think to me it is more of a build around than people think it is.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Like, just to expand on that idea.
So the idea, like, there are some cards like Tymna. There are cards that you build around, and while Professional Facebreaker can't be in the command zone, there are cards that we specifically build around. Like we build around stacks effects. Like you build around Rule of Law. You build around your Collector Oof and not being able to use artifacts. And so for Professional Facebreaker, in order to get the full advantage out of all of the utility of that card, because it does offer a lot, you have to really commit to it. And to commit to that kind of strategy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, there is a reason that I don't play it in Arden Crom, for instance. And that is a deck that you would think would get really good advantage out of it. But one of the things that I found with that deck is it wants more impactful things at the 3 mana position, right? So at 3 mana, I'm now evaluating it against like Sword of Fire and Ice, right? And how does that like compete with like overlap with my game plan and stuff like that? Where I've just kind of been like, I just think Professional Facebreaker doesn't quite get good enough in this. Where I think I would much rather play something like Smothering Tide. I was going to play an effect like that, where it really gives me that ability to produce mana on a consistent basis. That's kind of something that I'm a little bit more interested in. Also, a card that I would be more interested in than this is like the new Beamtown Beatstick card from March of the Machines. That basically, whenever your creature that it's equipped to deals combat damage, you make a treasure. And that is one of the things where, I'm not going to be attacking with multiple creatures in Art and Crom, right? So I'm not going to get more than one out of this. So this is like fine. And then like compare that to something like Art and Silas, where like I am playing way more creatures because I'm less reliant on Crom. And now I am playing Grim Hireling, right? Granted, if Art and Crom could play Grim Hireling, I think it would.
Yeah,
Grim Hireling is just good enough to play. But all that said, I kind of agree with this. I think it's in one of the things you'll see as a common theme throughout these cards that we're talking about is that we're talking about these in situations, right? And that's some important context that I do want to kind of add to this is like, we aren't saying don't play this card ever. What we are saying is this is not an auto include the way that Mystical Tutor is, the way that Vampiric Tutor is, right? This is a card that you really have to evaluate how it holds up against the rest of your deck, and if your deck can support a card.
Yeah. I think the big takeaway for this episode is having intentionality with your card choices.
Yep. Very much so.
Yeah. One last note on Facebreaker that Sage kind of brought up, but it's one of those rare creatures where it would be better if it was legendary.
Oh, could you imagine if this was legendary? What a fun commander.
If this was a commander, it'd be an outlet for infinite Dockside Man.
It would be a very good
if you if you can't guarantee that out of the command zone, then it's not really worth considering that. But if it was
because what's the situation where you would tutor this up?
Right.
I would wonder if I'm curious, because I'm trying to think if this is a legendary creature, is it better or worse than Magda?
I think it's different. I don't know that it's better or worse.
But I'm just thinking from like a mono red deck, like which one would I think is better? And that's
I think
now, granted, as I have said, all mono red decks are just Goto in a trench coat. But
actually, straight up, if this was a mono red commander, it might actually fill the niche that like I think probably exists out there, and we just don't have the commander for it yet. With like those Punisher creatures, like Eidolon of the Great Revel and stuff like that, where you actually just legit play a beatdown deck, and then you happen to maybe have like something. Yeah,
you would have you would have a lot of small evasive creatures, and it would be a Cloudstone Curio deck because you would do the Cloudstone loop, you get all the treasures, and you could play your entire deck or whatever. And then in the meantime, you're like punishing people, you're getting in, you're playing prison effects, you're controlling combat. Yeah, I think it'd be very fun.
It'd be very interesting. Anyhow, Goto in a trench coat, all mono red decks. They all do the same thing, just in different ways. Just slightly different ways. It's all the same thing. Anyway, next card on our list. This is a card I put on the list, and it's really more of a signpost card, and that's Eidolon of Rhetoric. And I'm just going to say pretty much all just straight up rule of law effects. Unless we're talking about something like Phyrexian Censor or the one from Zendikar Rising that I'm blanking on. Archon of Emeria. Unless we're talking about very specific ones like that, or Aether's War Canonist, or the things that you are able to like kind of wedge yourself out of in a way, if that makes sense. I think these just straight up rule of laws that don't have any other plus side to them. I think rule of laws on their own are very bad strategy. I think it is a losing strategy. I think you are setting yourself up to not be successful if you're playing rule of laws. And the reason I think that is the way the meta has evolved is it feels very much to me like we have returned in some form to the Flash days with rule of law, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that I don't feel like it doesn't win your opponents the game like it did when Flash was around. Because one of the things for those who are newer to the format is that rule of laws used to be virtually unplayable when Flash Hulk was a thing. Because you were guaranteeing the Flash Hulk deck at the table won that game. You just waited until people had cast spells, and then you just Flash Hulked on top of everything. Eidolon of Rhetoric and these just straight up rule of laws are, to me, dangerous because you have to dilute your deck's quality because you have to play a high enough density of them for them to matter. Because a rule of law on its own, everybody's ready for it, right? Every Adnaz deck is ready for it. They're just going to play a bounce spell and do their thing. And generally be able to maybe cast a silence right after. They're not hard to deal with. Where rule of laws are good is when they're in groups. So you generally want 2 or more rule of laws out for rule of law to really be effective. And so because of that, I don't think these only rule of law effects are quite good. If I were playing rule of laws, and if I were to talk about rule of laws that I would be okay with playing, like I said, Archon of Emeria, either Sworn Canonist, Deafening Silence. I think if you're a creature-based deck, I think Deafening Silence is a really easy auto include, because it's very easy to just slam that down and
at 1 mana, right?
Yeah, and at 1 mana, it's very aggressively costed. It's easy to play. Same thing for Eidolon, or not Eidolon, rather Aether Sworn Canonist. The effect that I think people want Rule of Law to have, I think, is better served by Grand Abolishers, Murals, cards like that, than Rule of Laws. And so I'm starting to come around even to the whole defense grid.
I was just about to ask, what do you think about defense grid?
I don't like defense grid specifically because of it taxes your stuff. But I've been playing a little bit more with 3 Fairy, and I'm actually seeing that card in a bit of a new light because I've seen it where, especially in a deck like Tivit, where an opponent disrupts to the win condition, Teferi stays out though because they're trying to use it as a way to, win. If you are in a blue deck that can support it, you are already playing a high enough density of blue counter magic and interaction pieces that you're going to be able to deal with whatever comes your way. So I tend to I'm starting to think that 3 Fairy is a little bit better than I had previously evaluated it. I also think some of that is indicative of the changes in the format and how the format has matured. I don't think a year ago I would have made that recommendation the way the meta was a year ago. I think a lot of our player base has matured in their ability to not just yeet themselves into the sun. And that's kind of why I've not liked 3 Fairy in the past, is because the person playing it would just throw themselves into the sun and then not have anything to back it up. Whereas now I see more people playing it and being very intentional with how they're playing it and when they're playing it and what they're keeping in case something goes sideways. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about that, because it's one of those cards that I really don't, I think I'd rather be playing that than Rule of Law. Because I think that is a much more actively good strategy. And that's kind of just my overall take is I think Control is better than Stacks. I think Stacks is very bad. I see Control winning significantly more. Control and mid-range are what Stacks wishes it was. And Stacks just, in my opinion, doesn't really hold up very well. Not sure what you think on that, James, but I've been watching your face.
Yeah, I classify those cards that you mentioned as the ones that you would replace Rule of Laws with as an entirely different thing. Now, I will say we may be at the point where you have enough density of good Rule of Laws where Rule of Law itself doesn't need to be played because it is the worst Rule of Law, right? Deafening Silence costs 1, great. And the ones that have legs are useful for other things.
Right.
Like if you're using them with Timna and Kamal or whatever else, like they have value as creatures. Worst comes to worst, you can Eldritch Evolution them to something else, which is pretty good.
Birthing Pod,
Eldritch Evolution, you can use them for pod lines, you can Eldritch Evolution them, Neoform them, you can sacrifice them to Vesh, whatever. So the creature ones all seem pretty reasonable. And of the creature ones, like Eidolon and Rhetoric is probably the worst of them because it's the most vulnerable. That being said, Grand Abolisher and Three Fairy and Myrel are all cards that allow you to do your thing versus Rules of Laws are the thing which you are doing. Now, we can debate whether or not it's a good thing to be doing. I think Stacks is fine. I think Stacks' biggest problem is and always has been and probably always will be the other players at the table not understanding what you're doing. And then there's, of course, the question of, like, do you have enough pressure, which is why a lot of Stacks decks, they have to be creature based. Like, it's why Winota is the one that shows up the most. It's because it goes from applying stacks to applying pressure very, very quickly. Yeah. But other decks can do that as well.
The other thing that Winota does that it's an important piece here, too, is a lot of Stacks decks kind of just fold to a board wipe. And Winota is a very notable exception to that because it's able to rebuild its board state quite rapidly, whereas other Stacks decks are not going to be able to rebuild their board in nearly the same fashion. That
is the counterplay is you don't have as much card advantage in most of these Stacks decks, which is a fair thing. But also, not every deck can have every tool available to it. That's probably healthier overall.
Right.
But I think Rule of Laws are healthy to include. I think that you have to be deliberately playing a Rule of Law deck to play them. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily think through that all the way. There's a couple you can get away with playing in non-Rule of Law decks. Like Deafening Silence, if you're just a general creature-based strategy, but you aren't necessarily really heavy on Rule of Laws, it's still probably fine. Same with like Aethersworn Canonist and Archon, and probably the new Phyrexian one too.
Yeah, Phyrexian generally,
if you want to do stuff with creatures, they're good. They're just generically good creatures, and that's what you want to be doing. A lot of Stacks decks, though, like they're gonna want. I think it was Cobblepot who used to say like the best thing that a Stacks deck can have is the second Rule of Law, right? The only thing better than the first Rule of Law is the second.
But that's kind of my issue with it, though, is in order to so we can cut back on playing the bad Rule of Laws, but then you're lowering your density of having Rule of Laws to play the second one. So you kind of do need to play the second one.
But when they've all got legs, it means that you turn, your Llanowar Elf can at any time become your second Rule of Law because they're all 2 and 3 drops, right? So you Eldritch Evolution your Llanowar Elf into Eidolon of Rhetoric, or you Birthing Pod your Llanowar Elf into Aethersworn Canons. So like when they have legs, they're really good. And I think more people probably need to, when they're building Stacks decks, keep that in mind, is like you need to be utilizing them as both creatures and Rules of Law, which is why I think Rule of Law itself is probably the most cuttable of them. and I guess by extension, Arcane Laboratory for any decks that are blue-based stacks decks. But when it comes to Three Fairy, like it's entirely different, right? It's protecting what you're doing. If you choose to play it, you are choosing to also become table police. So it puts a different value on removal and interaction.
Well,
and
if you choose to play it and then not win that turn, you have to be able to play
right? And that's
police.
The thing, right? And that's kind of the issue with it, right? It's a 3 mana card that like you need to win with it then. And there are ways you can do that, like Displacer Kit or whatever else. But I find that to fill a very different role than what Rule of Laws are filling.
I mean, I would agree with that, right? Like Three Fairy shows up in like different types of decks, but I guess my point isn't necessarily to replace them, but rather I just don't think you should be playing Rule of Laws in general. And like, I don't think that they are like, I think a really good example is Arden Tana. I know I talk a lot about Arden on this show, but that's because I play a lot of Arden, so deal with it. But in like Arden Tana, I like Scoots and Cicada's build of that deck is very heavy on Rule of Laws. And I personally think that when you are playing a deck that relies very heavily on using equipment in a way that's going to extract a lot of value out of your creatures and make your creatures better, I think restricting how much and your ability to play them is not wise.
Not being
the
able
other
to like
thing,
double spell in your equipment. Yeah.
This is the other thing that I think not enough people remember with Rule of Laws is because when you're playing Rule of Law, in your deck, you now have to evaluate every card in your deck on the axis of, do I want this to be my spell per turn? And if it's not good enough to be that, then you probably shouldn't play it, which cuts a lot of really good cards from being in your deck because as a just one spell for turn, they aren't quite very good. So that's kind of where I land on it. I generally think Rule of Laws are not well positioned. I generally think that Stacks is not particularly well positioned. But that's also,
I think to a certain extent, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like once you start saying Rule of Law isn't good enough and people start not playing Rule of Laws, you lose one of those balancing points against the decks that are super fast. And even with, decks like Rogsai or whatever else having answers to Rule of Laws in the form of Cyclonic Rift or whatever the hell, you still want to ask that question. You want to make them have it, right? Because there's a lot of times that those decks get away with not having it because no one attempts to make them have it. And the fewer times you put something in place to say, do you have it, the more they can get away with not ever having it.
I will say, I do like Rule of Law in decks that have the ability to win the game quite quickly and win the game without really needing to cast spells. I think Minsk and Boo,
that's a good one.
The creature one, the Naya one, is a deck where I'm like, you play Rule of Law, baby. That's a great place for him. And I think decks that can win the game in a reasonable manner, Rule of Law is fine. And that is an important caveat to give on that. But my general analysis of it is I just see so many of these like combat focused, combat oriented. We're just going to beat you in the face and try to win that way. These win conless per se stacks decks playing Rule of Laws. And I'm like, you can't just rely on Rule of Law getting you there. You have to be able to win the game. And so that's why I look at most because I see Rule of Law in like a deck like Minsk acting like a mural almost. And it's just like, you just have more of those cards at your disposal. And when you're playing stuff like Cavern of Souls that will guarantee that you're either of your, what's it called? Rectors resolve, then like it's not a huge deal. Same thing where you're playing the green. You're also playing Allosaurus Shepherd in a deck like that. So there's a lot of things where it acts like protection almost in those decks, where I think that's fine. I don't love it as just a stacks piece on its own, and then my game plan is play rule of law and then beat your face in. You're not going to win games doing that game plan. It's just, I've never seen that be effective. It's the only time I've ever seen it be effective is when Charles is playing the stacks deck. But there's a few things that Charles does. He doesn't just play rule of laws. He plays a lot of stacks effects.
I think understanding that every deck, even though a deck might not be in the proactive archetype, every deck should have a proactive plan. And if that is rule of law, your plan is not complete.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. I could talk about this all day. Next card on our list, or next really section here, is where we're next. Like groupings of cards are wheels, and in specific, Wheel of Misfortune and Windfall are the two big ones. But even to some lesser extent, Time Twister and Wheel of Fortune are just maybe things that you should avoid playing. And I actually am starting to lean into the camp of don't think you should ever play these cards unless you're playing Narset, Notion Thief, things that restrict draws. I don't think you should be playing these cards. And I know both James and Sage put either one of or all of these cards on this list. So Sage, we'll start with you on this. So your experience, you play a lot of like Turbo Red, and even
Red Storm.
In Red Storm, you do a lot of stuff with like Omnath and stuff like this. What are your thoughts on these wheels? Because a lot of Turbo players will tell you, I need this to win.
Oh man, so first and foremost, Wheel of Fortune is one of my favorite cards of all time. I love that old fashioned art. I kind of want a tattoo of it. But the thing is that especially without access to something like Hole Breacher that, every deck could basically with blue could play. If you're not in a storm deck, if you're not in a turbo deck that is explicitly relying on high card velocity in order to have a big storm turn to finish to go off, if you are anything slower than that, you do not need wheels. And looking specifically at Windfall, because blue has so many different card advantage engines that you don't need a Windfall.
Just play Ponder. Play Ponder. It's good. Trust me. It's a very good card.
And so the thing is like, even with Breach, like I don't play Windfall. I have taken Wheel of Fortune out of Omnath, even though I am a Breach and I want to fill my graveyard. If I want to fill my graveyard, there are other cards that I can play that are going to be useful for that, like looking at Dragon's Rage Channeler. Like that's going to give you card velocity.
That card is so underplayed.
That card is Darcy's so good. But yeah, that's going to give me card velocity. It's going to give me card selection. It's going to fill my graveyard for Breach, and it's not going to refill my opponent's hands. Wheels were very good when Freeze Thief was like really big, and you could proactively play Hole Breacher, Narset, and Notion Thief, and then because like you are stripping your opponents of resources, and Poor Alms Collector. I was trying to think. I was like, "What's that 4-mana cat that no one plays?"
Yeah. Pepperidge Farm remembers.
God, poor Alms Collector. So it's like when you have an abundance of wheels, there is value in that disruption. That is true of making your opponents cycle through their hands and not throwing them off their game plans. But the thing is when we have so many tutors that tutor to the top of the deck that you can wheel someone into something that they want, And then inevitably in, decks that are really, relying on blue, relying on interaction, like you are just increasing the odds that they are going to find the answer to stop you.
Increasing the odds you're going to lose.
And so then there's a diminishing return on the disruption of the hands, because ultimately you can disrupt their proactive plans, but you can disrupt your own plans because you wheel them into something that's going to stop you. And so for just straight up wheels, like you can find other things that fit that need. If you need to put cards in your graveyard, if you need to see more cards, if you need to draw more cards to have more options available to you. And so I think like having that intentionality with wheels is really important. Why I do like Time Twister, but even still, I'm not putting it really into any blue decks anymore, because Time Twister has the upside of graveyard hate, which is important for all the breach decks running around. It also with Winds of Change, it fucks up tutors. There's no reason you can't tutor with it and get your advantage off of that. So it's like, but even still, like I don't play Time Twister. And I love that card.
Yeah.
There was a time, even before Hull Breacher, where during the Flash era, where wheels were very good, specifically because it would disrupt Hulk very, very, very effectively. Yeah. And James, you played during that era.
I did.
For people who aren't aware of how that worked, why were wheels specifically good then versus now?
So one piece of it is, of course, breach didn't exist for most of that time period. So
there was a month gap where it did.
When people were utilizing their graveyard, it was a lot more specifically focused on like 1-to-1 value type things, like reanimate or animate dead or whatever. So you didn't really care as much about dumping things in the yard and being able to throw off whatever was in somebody's hand. Because oftentimes, if you're a Flash player, you have to have 2 cards in hand to actually go off. You have to have Flash, you have to have Hulk. And then you
also have to have some
have
cards not in hand too.
Right, also true. You had to have cards not in hand, which is important. So you have to have 2 cards. So already, if you've got a full grip of 7 cards, that means there's 5 other cards there that could be interaction or whatever else. And if realistically throughout a game, you're not going to have a full grip the whole time. So if their hand is like 5 cards, they've only got probably 3 things that are going to be in there besides the Flash and Hulk. And probably 1 or 2 of those are pieces of interaction. So even being able to play a wheel and fish out some of that interaction was good. It could be used as a decoy to eat interaction. And if you get through the interaction, if they've got the Flash and the Hulk in their hand, they bin it, that's usually very good for you. Now, they could be running something like Reanimate or Animate Dead or whatever to get that Hulk back, which was not uncommon. But
now you're dealing with like a sorcery speed
exactly
deal instead of on top of everything.
Right. And like you mentioned, if they draw into whatever their piece was, oftentimes nomads or cephalid illusionists, that then also limits what they're going to be able to do, which not exactly, their best plan. Now, granted, nomads and cephalid, you can just play. They're cheap, but if you have to play them out, then that opens them up to other windows of interaction. Now, I will kind of take what something Sage said in the last segment, and what they said was, or a couple segments ago, Professional Facebreaker is kind of a build-around card. Wheels are also build-around cards at this point. I will give more of a pass to Wheel of Fortune and Time Twister for 2 very specific reasons. Both of them guarantee you 7 cards. Yes, they also guarantee your opponent 7 cards, but they always have the same rate of return. You are always going to get 7 cards, which is good. And with Wheel, it puts it in your yard. And with Time Twister, it doesn't put it in yard, but it disrupts other people's yards and has the opportunity to be part of. I know people don't use Twister loops anymore, but like
Twister loops exist. They used to be a thing. I remember doing them, but like I hate them personally.
No, it's long, it's complicated, but like they're there, right? But with Wheel of Misfortune and Windfall, especially, like they feel really underwhelming a lot of the time. Like people get this idea with Windfall in their hand, like, oh, if I've been feeding this fish, maybe somebody's going to have 10, 11, 12 cards in hand. I'll be able to draw that. Like, don't do that. Don't think about that. Don't think about the best case scenario. Most of the time when you resolve a Windfall, you're going to get 3 or 4 cards. There are other ways you can do that.
Yeah.
with Wheel of Misfortune, you're not even guaranteed to get cards.
Yeah.
Like if you are the person who is casting a Wheel of Misfortune because you need to get cards off a Wheel of Misfortune, that is not where you want to be.
And it also doesn't
play you on that.
Guarantee you're disrupting your opponents either.
Also true.
Because your opponents can all just say 0 and then nobody does. You just paid 3 mana for nothing.
Right.
Which and like also being a Red Storm player, that feels very bad. I took out Wheel of Misfortune out of Bergie for quite a long time because you don't get that upside of disruption. You're like, oh, for sure they have interaction because they didn't throw away their hand. They paid more life for me.
Wheels also have this awkward thing where like they're really, really good if you're like player 1 or player 2 on turn 1. If you can wheel on turn 1 as one of the first 2 players in the game, that's probably the best place to wheel. And then they're not really that good again until later in the game. And later in the game, everybody is benefiting from that card draw. So they're better when your card value or your card quality is higher, or when you really want to draw 7 cards. Now there are decks that really want to draw 7 cards.
I will put a condition on your first turn wheel. It's good on your first turn if you are player 1.
Absolutely.
Anywhere
player 1 or player 2.
Any other seat at the table. Turn 1.
You don't want to do it as the 3rd player or the 4th player. I think it's fine if you're also the 2nd player. But
depending on the turn that the first player had.
You don't really.
Well, and the reason I say that is because I've very often seen this actually happened to me when I was at Pun City, or not Pun City, at Silicon Dynasty, is that I sat down at a table. I was going 4th in the pod. Second player was playing that like teamer, like every time you're Xyrus. And player 1 was on Timnacron, something or other. And basically empties their hand, playing stuff down. And then the next player just plays Winds of Change, or not Winds of Change, Wheel of Fortune. And I just sit there and I like stare at them and I'm like, so we're just giving them a new hand?
Yeah.
This seems like the worst idea imaginable.
And that's why they're very much build arounds. Like you have to be playing those other pieces to get the value off them, whether it's, Alms Collector may Alms Collector rip in pieces, but Notion Thief, Narset, there's a couple other things like Waste Not, honestly, is probably fine still. But at that point, you're building a wheel deck. Yeah. If you are not building a wheel deck, like probably Wheel of Fortune is decent enough in enough decks that it's fine. And Time Twister, I think, has enough other uses where like it's a fine card.
But they're situational.
We're talking about like. Yeah, and these are going to be like, if you're making your list, these are probably like your 97th, 98th, 99th card. Like these are towards the bottom of the list of what you're making. Simply because, it's not going to necessarily always do the thing you want it to do unless you are specifically building your deck to do that. And there are decks that do that. Like I still think Opus Thief is a totally fine deck to be playing.
Oh, yeah.
Like, but it's very specifically a wheels deck. Like just throwing out a Winds of Change like in your Rog side deck probably isn't really doing anything.
Oh, Winds of Change in Rogside? That's fucking garbage.
No. Right? Yeah,
you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
I look at so many wheels and like the way I evaluate wheels and the reason I don't play them is that now this is from the perspective of a control mid-range player, right? So take this from that perspective is I sit there and do the mental math of, okay, I'm paying 3 mana so that I can draw 7 cards. My payoff for that, or my trade-off for that, is my opponents are now also drawing 7 cards each. And in 1v1, it's a lot easier to see that as an equal exchange, right? The problem is we're in multiplayer, and you have now lost that exchange by 14 cards. That is huge when we are playing a format where priority position matters and cards in your opponent's hands are tools against you. You don't want your opponents to have 7 cards in hand, in my opinion, at any point in the game. The more cards your opponents have in their hands, the worse, the the worse off you are. There's a reason why we say don't feed the fish, don't feed the heuristic study. There's a reason why we say pay for Sentinel, right? I just think playing these cards is completely antithetical to the idea of, hey, we should not be doing this thing where we are exchanging 7 card, getting a new 7 in exchange for giving my opponents 21 cards. I don't think that's a good value proposition. Now, a card that I do think, if you are needing these types of effects that you should consider, is like Valakut. What's the one that's like an instant? You discard
Valakut Awakening,
Valakut Awakening, or something like that. Where they are just for you. They're not as like explosive, but they're going to provide you the same value without a very similar amount of value, without the drawbacks of giving your opponents 21 cards. And that's kind of the thing that, I mean, and that's how I look at this, is if I were to ever tell you, hey, you can draw 7 cards, everybody else is going to draw, and everybody else gets 21, your opponents get 21. I don't think in any like world you would look at that and say, oh, that's good for me. I think there are very limited situations and windows where Wheel of Fortune itself is good. I think Time Twister, you don't need to play it anymore. If you are playing, just play. If you want to be disrupting graveyards, play Grafdigger's Cage, play Rest in Peace, play Dothy. You've got plenty
Soulless
of things
Jailer.
to just Soulless Jailer. You have so many things that can disrupt graveyards now. I don't think the value proposition of Time Twister disrupting graveyards is there anymore. Like, you also have endurance loops that replace the Time Twister loops, right? It does the exact same thing effectively. So for me, I look at it and I go, I don't know that the value proposition is worth it for me. Granted, again, that comes from me playing from a very mid-range. Like, if I was a football coach, I would very much be, James will know who I'm talking about. I very much come from the Jim Tressel school of like theology on how to coach and how to coach a game. Very conservative in a lot of my choices with how I approach deck building. And some people, that's fine, are also maybe a little bit more close to, what's his name out at USC, James?
At USC?
Yeah, it used to be Oklahoma's coach.
Lincoln
Riley. Some people a little bit more Lincoln Riley. And that's okay. But Lincoln Riley doesn't play defense. We like to play defense around here.
Yeah. Like, I'll say, like, I play a lot of mid-range as well. And I keep Twister in a lot of decks, but I keep it in those decks when they also have Notion Thief and ways to find Notion Thief pretty easily and quickly, like with Neoform or Eldritch Evolution. Because if I can, like, flash in a Notion Thief at end of turn, or if I have enough mana to Neoform, a 3-drop into Notion Thief, or Thrasios into Notion Thief, and then follow it up with Twister, like, I'll do that. But yeah, it's definitely not a thing that like you need to be playing no matter what.
Yeah.
Agreed.
It's defensible in the right deck, but you gotta build around it.
So the next, I'm going to kind of group these cards together, are these like very okay tutors. And I'm going to add one honestly to the list because I also think that it's very bad. But we've got Praetor's Grasp, Wishclaw Talisman, and I'm going to just say it, Grim Tutor. I said this 2 weeks ago. I think that if Phoenix made this point for me very well, is that Bring to Light is a better return, or is a better rate to playing your Ad Nauseam or playing whatever you are wanting to play than Grim Tutor or Wishclaw Talisman. And Wishclaw Talisman was a card that James felt particularly about, and I'll let you kind of touch on that, and then we'll eventually talk. We'll get back to Praetor's Grasp here in a moment for Sage. But Wishclaw Talisman is a card that I know you are not a fan of.
Yeah. So Wishclaw Talisman has two downsides in my eyes as a card that people should be playing. Although I think it's funny that you bring up Grim Tutor, because I actually think people should be playing Grim Tutor over Wishclaw. But that's neither here nor there. Wishclaw Talisman has two issues in that. One, it's an artifact. And two, it has a major drawback if you fail to go off. If you fail to win, you have given your opponents another tutor. That alone is pretty bad. The second problem is because it's an artifact, if you're not winning with it that turn, it feels pretty bad because there's lots of things that can turn it off. Oof exists. Null Rod exists. You can only use it as a sorcery, so it's not like you can activate it at the end of an opponent's turn. Or you can use it as an instant, but you can only use it on your turn.
Correct.
You can only use it on your turn, so you can't, go and find something during somebody else's turn to minimize those effects. It feeds Dockside. I mean, how often do you hear people complain about Dockside? Oh, Dockside made this many treasures and it was just too many, and stop feeding it. Like, if you can't win the game that turn, don't play the thing that is going to feed it. Now, obviously, it's different with like Mana Rocks. Like, if you want to play that Soul Ring and develop your board, sure, fine, whatever, that makes sense. It does not make sense with Wishclaw Talisman. It's a 3-mana tutor. That is what it should be played as. And when people don't play it as that, they are setting themselves up to get burnt by it. And there are 3-mana tutors that are better than it. I think Grim Tutor is better than it. I think there's other things you could make an argument for.
Sage, are you playing Bring Delight in Omnath?
No, I do not.
You should. Let me Bring to Light as an S tier tutor.
The other thing about Bring to Light that's also very nice is that you can use treasures to make any colored mana.
Exactly.
So you can actually get it higher.
That's one of the arguments I've made for it is, guys, we live in a Dockside world. I'm making 5 colors I'm not worried about. At
a certain point, when you have enough cards that like you really want to be using, and you have a density of it, like if you're an Ad Nauseam deck, you are probably already running Demonic Tutor. You're probably already running Mystical Tutor, Vampire Tutor, Imperial Seal. You may or may not be running Diabolic Intent. There's 4 or 5 tutors already. They get the one card you care about.
Right.
You probably don't need the 5th or 6th tutor. Especially if you've already got 5, you probably don't need that 6th tutor. That's probably overkill. And a lot of these decks are also cutting on types of interaction. Now, usually they have some variety of counter spells and bounce spells. But like, how many times do people lose a game to like a card like Winota or any other commander that just takes over a game? Like you're running 2 bounce spells and a Swords to Plowshares as your creature room. Bounce spells aren't really that effective against creatures because they replay them and just go off. So you're running 1, maybe 2 pieces of dedicated creature removal, and then you're losing to creatures. Like maybe that tutor should be another thing that kills a creature. Maybe it should be something else that's relevant.
Or another advantage engine.
Right. And some of these decks are running Wishclaw and aren't running, say, Opposition Agent. Now, to be fair, you should probably run the two together. But if you're running Wishclaw, not Opposition Agent, I would run Opposition Agent over it. It's a body. It's useful. It has flash. That's nice. And it is disruptive. Like, there's a lot of things that I think are a better fit than Wishclaw, especially in a world where Dockside is so common.
Yeah, unless you're playing...
And because it just telegraphs what you're doing.
Yeah, unless you're playing it in a Displacer Kitten deck where you can take advantage of play it, activate it, blink it, bring it, tutor again. Like...
Well, that kind of goes along with everything we've been saying, is it's like, this is a card that isn't an auto-include, but is really good insert place where it is really good and you should play it, right? And there's absolutely places where this is a fantastic card. But like, I even look at Grim Tutor and I go, okay, it's 3 mana. I'm pretty sure I just have better cards that can go just get things straight to the battlefield that I think I would rather be playing. I think Entomb is better than Grim Tutor, personally. In my opinion. But that is generally also because I like cheap, quick interaction, or cheap, quick tutors over slow, expensive ones. And
I forgot to mention Gamble. Gamble's the tutor people are obviously playing before Wishclaw. So like, that makes Wishclaw 6 or 7, right?
Yeah. Sage, you are not a fan of Praetor's Grasp, and I'm not a fan of it specifically because I think it is literally impossible to resolve correctly over webcam, which is why I do not think it should be permitted in webcam games, because it changes the functionality of the card. That is my soapbox. I do not think Chaos, Mox Masters, whatever online tournament you're doing, whenever Monarch comes back doing online tournaments, Praetor's Grasp should be banned in online tournaments, in my opinion, because of the fact that you cannot resolve it correctly, meaning it completely changes how the card works fundamentally. And it gives the person playing the Praetor's Grasp a giant advantage that they shouldn't have, and they wouldn't have in real life. So I do think that is a thing against it, in my opinion. That's my biggest thing. That's me as a judge in a TO, like going, this card is problematic from a game standpoint.
I feel like that was a far more relevant complaint before Opposition Agent got printed, because Opposition Agent does let you look at their hand, which, like, it gets really weird really fast.
Well, that's the thing, is like Opposition Agent, though, is worded to let you do that. Praetor's Grasp, in my opinion, is not. Like, if I'm IRL, I can't look at your hand, I can't look at your deck list. So the way that we do things over webcam is we look at deck lists, and then we have to go, okay, I want to grab this card, and then we find out, oh, that's not in their list. And people have found all sorts of ways where it's like, oh, well, hold it up to the camera and close your eyes. It's like, okay, no. Listen. You cannot resolve it correctly over webcam. It's impossible. You can't do it. So, in my opinion, you shouldn't be able to play it over webcam. Just ban it. Straight up. That is my soapbox on the card. Sage has a completely different soapbox. So, Sage, what are your thoughts on Praetor's Grasp?
No, and I definitely agree with that. Having it over webcam, like, you get so much more information that you wouldn't be able to get, because if you're sitting at a table and playing with your opponents, if you're gonna try and piece together what cards they have in their hand based off what is in their library, that's slow play, like, straight up. But it's also how the rules for online tournaments are written, so that you can resolve this card. You just should ban the card. I think it's the easier, cleaner solution. I agree, and why I don't think you should really be playing it in the first place is that I think a lot of decks tend to play Praetor's Grasp because they don't have access to blue, and they want to play your Thassa's Oracle so that they can win. That doesn't make sense to me, because for one, for Praetor's Grasp, you don't get to spend manas over mana of any color to cast it. So what are you gonna, like, you gonna crack your LED so you can play your play your opponent's Thassa's Oracle? Like, I don't know. So the mana situation, and of course, I mean, with the prevalence of treasures, it's easier to get around that. I get that, but with the mana restrictions, there, I think it makes it not great. It's a 3 mana tutor, and if you are in a black deck without blue, you have access to so many more, like, proactive ways for you to win the game and close the game that you should just be tutoring for instead. Like, I don't know. Like, so I don't really understand the functionality of the card. And if you're trying to do it to, like, get someone to keep them off of their win condition, I don't think that is an interesting or a good way to play, or, like, to sequence your turns. Like, that is not putting your strategy forward.
It's not a great use of 3 mana.
Yeah, and, like, it's not a great use of 3 mana, and, decks have multiple ways to win. If you take them off one line, they still have 1, 2, 3, 4 other lines that they can do, and so that's not really an effective obstacle in order to propel you forward enough to win the game. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just like, if you really want another tutor, play another tutor, play a piece of interaction, play card drop, play something that play something that gives you more card velocity so you can see more cards per turn. Like, what this card is trying to do is too many things, and it doesn't do any of them very well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on
that. This feels like a vestigial piece of like what cEDH was prior to.
For sure.
I would say probably prior to Commander Legends is really when this like started to switch. But like, you're absolutely right. It's a card that does a lot of things like mediocrely well.
Such a good way of
because it does so many things in a mediocre way. People are like, oh, it's good enough because it can do all these different things that I can want. It can get whatever. But like, if you're using it, like you said, to keep somebody off of something, well, then just play more interaction. That's relevant. If you're using it to tutor up a win con, play a win con that is relevant to your deck that you can actually build around. If you're using it to tutor for something because you play in such an inbred meta that you know that every deck is going to be having something, play something that is more relevant to your inbred meta that is actually good. Like,
and here's the thing. Yeah. I've started evaluating cards based on what we're seeing at tournaments, and the tournament data so far does not support the idea that this card is going to work the way you want it to north of 25% of your games. And that is because people are playing some fucking wild shit.
True.
There are people who are genuinely going to tournaments and are playing stuff that you are not expecting to see. I mean, Atraxa just won. What was it? Chaos yesterday. So I mean, we're seeing that the metagame is. Yes, Timnacrom is made up of a lot. It is a high density of what we are seeing. Its turnover rate is, or its what's the word? Its conversion rate is not there. It is significantly lower than like Nigila's ability to win. Tivit, honestly. Like Tivit and Thrasios Bruce are two, and honestly, Rograk Silas, Rocco, and like those like handful of decks have a better return on like what you are going to like your success than like Timnacrom.
I want to hesitate. I want to pause you a little bit because we want to make sure that we also keep in mind that all of this information does not is blinded to who the pilots are for some of these things. So
that's true.
Some of these decks have very good conversion rates, but are piloted by like two people who are very good players as well.
Well, I mean, I will say
we want to be very careful to go into like any of these numbers completely like, yes, the numbers exist. They're a tool. Let's not let them be a Bible.
Well, I see here just like a lot of people who aren't Ian, for instance, playing Tivit. Like I have two entries that I can see for Ian on Tivit, and one he won the whole thing with, and the other he went 2, 3, and 1. Everybody else's win rates are around 40 to 50%. And there's
that's pretty impressive.
37 entries on here. So like it is very consistently putting up like over 20%, like an over 25% conversion rate, which is ridiculous.
Really
I actually think Tivit might be one of the best decks in the format.
Real good deck.
Tivit's really good.
It
turns out one of the 5 Titans is banned, and it turns out that having a Titan in your command zone is really good because that's what Tivit is. It is Esper Titan.
I think to go on a small tangent, I do think Kronos or what is it, the new Mardu card,
Kroxa
and Kronos. I think it's going to fall into a similar niche as Tivit. Because I think it has a lot of the same qualities. I think Dog Food Chain is.
I'm here. I'm with it. I want to make this with you.
I'm very into it. But yeah, that's kind of just my take on it. Is that Praetor's Grasp really relies on everybody kind of being on the same thing, and there are a lot of very successful decks out there that are on black, that are on blue, that are on those things. You'll notice a significant lack of Praetor's Grasp in the successful decks in those. And I think Praetor's Grasp really relies on, it's like the definition of a parasitic card, right? Because it is completely reliant on the meta being this way. And if you get paired into a pod that is like Naya, blue-green, and like Selvala, and you just kind of sit there and you draw this card and you're like, I have no idea what I'm looking for with this. Yeah. And I'm sure you can find something. But
it's parasitic, but it's not even good at being a parasite.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the littlest tapeworm.
Oh wow, that's gonna be our new the Mind Sculptors book for kids. The littlest tapeworm.
Do I have to make the littlest tapeworm merch now? This is my Mind Sculptors drop shop is going to be just a bunch of like random sayings from the show. Next up on our list here is we're looking at 2 CMC mana rocks, specifically Grim Monolith, and I added to the list Felwar Stone because I have a huge soapbox for Felwar Stone that I'm sure that I've gone into on this podcast before. But James, you particularly are not a fan of Grim Monolith. I am also not a fan of Grim Monolith for what it's worth. But
I'm not a fan of Grim Monolith for basically the same reason I'm not a fan of Wishclaw Talisman. It is basically telegraphing what you're doing. If you play it and use it the same turn, it's +1 mana. There are better mana rocks that are +1 mana to use out there. Like most decks that are going to use that kind of mana are already on whatever Spirit Guides can be on, but a lot of them like aren't on Mox Amber. Some of them aren't even on Mox Opal. Even, you've got your spells that like randomly like do a thing and then make a treasure randomly. Like making a free Lotus Petal oftentimes is good enough. All of these decks are on Lotus Petal already, so I can't say that one, but when you're playing Grim Monolith, most of the time you're not playing it and then immediately tapping it for mana. Most of the time you're playing it, passing turn, getting set up for what's coming up in the future. And then it's not great there. Like compare it to Mana Vault. Mana Vault's a colorless Dark Ritual. Is it perfect? No. Does it run into some problems sometimes? Yes. But a colorless Dark Ritual is still really good.
Right.
Versus like a colorless Rite of Flame that sometimes makes less mana than Rite of Flame because Rite of Flame's weird.
Well, better comparison is it's a colorless Cabal ritual without the upside.
Without threshold. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And that's not great.
Here, it's Desperate Ritual. There you go.
Yes, thank you. There we go. It's called as Desperate Ritual.
We got there eventually.
yeah. But doesn't like it feeds Dockside again. It again gets shut off by Collector Oof, Null Rod, whatever. And it really doesn't have a whole lot of upside because you really only use it once. I mean, the number of times where I have seen full price paid to untap a Grim Monolith in a game is incredibly low, and I think correlates to winning exactly 0% of the time. I don't think I've ever seen somebody hard untap a Grim Monolith and go on to win the game. If you're like playing Urza and you're playing Power Artifact, then like, yeah, sure, Grim Monolith's right. If you're playing Kinnan and playing Power Artifact, I guess Grim Monolith's good enough, but like you have Basalt Monolith.
Play Basalt Monolith, it's better. And you don't need like 4 cards to set it up.
Right. You don't have to jump through hoops. I will say, however, I'm gonna call you on Felwar Stone. If you had asked me like 2 years ago, Felwar Stone, like I probably would have said, yeah, it's overrated. I actually think Felwar Stone continually gets better because people are playing more 5-color lands. And as people play more 5-color lands, Felwar Stone continually is a better card than it otherwise
So
would
the
be.
reason I put it here is because I see it so often in decks that it has no business being in. That is like 3 colors in down decks. Just don't play the card in the deck. Just make it a talisman. Like there was
no, I'd play a talisman before it most of the time.
Like in 4+ color decks, Felwar Stone's great. I personally don't love it because, especially going first, no value there whatsoever. Because if you go land, Mana Crypt, Felwar Stone, I can't do shit with that.
I mean, sometimes your opponent.
Sometimes you can, but
gemstone caverns. It's really good if your opponent has gemstone.
I'm not willing to take those odds, though.
Yeah.
So I don't gamble personally for a living, so I generally like to play cards that I think will consistently give me a return on my investment. And I don't think Felwar Stone is a card that does. I think the decks that do want to be playing this again, same thing for Grim Monolith, in my opinion. It's Nos decks, right? The decks that do want to be playing this are decks that can convert their cards into mana very quickly for a turn, because that's what they need. You could make an argument that maybe like Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual might just be like a hair better because of the fact that they don't feed Docksides.
And they make colored mana.
And you can buy them back with other things from your graveyard because they go to the graveyard for Breach that you can exile to pay for escape costs. They have so much more upside because they're not permanents just sitting there.
And so Past in Flames is a card that I think a lot of these decks should also be considering. Because I'm just like, guys, has nobody played Giftstorm? Like, it's shocking to me, and I understand that. Like, I'm not saying don't play Grim Monolith in your Storm deck, but I'm also saying, hey, maybe you should, if your game plan is to go off after an ad nauseum, maybe you should have some more like colored rituals in your deck. I don't know. Maybe you should be playing Manamorphose. I've heard it's a good card. It probably should have been banned in Modern a while ago, but it's one of those things where I just look at Felwar Stone, and the signpost that I will always use for it was, for a very long time, I was a huge... I've always not liked the card. But there was a game where because Phoenix helps me, or did help me build the Lavinia deck and keep that updated when it was on the database and we were actively playing it. In this 2-color list, you want Lavinia to come down very early, ideally on turn 1, immediately. And this does not get you to a turn 1 Lavinia every time you see it, which means that the value proposition for this card in a deck like Lavinia is literally zero, because you're not getting what you want from it in the situation that you need it for. The other examples are in 2-color decks that want to be coming down really fast. I think let me put a very specific caveat in this. If your commander has more than 2 colored pips, or more than 1 color pip in their casting cost, I don't think you should be playing Felwar Stone, because of the fact that it's like, if it's 2 colorless and a blue for Malcolm, right? I totally understand that, right? More than likely, you're going to be able to produce a blue mana somehow through a land. And so I'm much more lenient or understanding of it in maybe that scenario. But when you're talking about decks like Ishai, or, decks that play, I mean, I'm trying to think of all the multiple pipped cards, like Tivit even. Like, you are not getting the full value out of the card, where I would just rather be playing like Talisman of Hierarchy, right? Like, just give me the 3rd talisman and let's call it a day. I want to make my colors. I don't care. If I'm sitting at a table and it's because this has happened to me before, it's Selvala, Kinnan, and then like, I don't know, Crick or whatever is the 3rd deck. I'm just sitting there as the blue-white deck going, well, I really hope Kinnan plays an island. Because it's just one of those things where I don't think you're getting the most out of it. But again, I've talked about that a lot on this podcast, historically speaking. Next up, we're going to look at some counter spells here. We've got both of you had some variation of these in your list of cards that you think are a little overplayed. I disagree on one of them, and that's a card that Sage put down. I think this card is very good, but the cards are an offer you can't refuse, dispel, miscast, and spell pierce. So I am not in the don't play dispel, don't play spell pierce, don't play an offer camp, because I tend to see those cards as a control player as good cards. I like counter spells.
I mean, I do too.
Yeah. Miscast, I think, is too narrow for what it does. Dispel, I get a little bit more. But tell me why these cards, because like you listed out Spell Pierce, and I don't agree with Spell Pierce. But I want to hear what you have to say.
So in turbo-oriented decks with blue, who are primarily looking to protect their win conditions and who want one CMC interaction in order so that they can conserve their mana in order to keep storming off after they've resolved their ad nauseum or their peer into the abyss, whatever. Fine. Play your fucking bad counter spells. Your 1 mana bad counter spells. The problem that I have with Miscast and Spell Pierce is I do not like counter spells where the opponent has an option to get out of it. And it doesn't happen often, but sometimes you know, after they have a big dockside and they play their, they play their game-winning spell, they have extra mana.
Yes.
Like, it's not hard when you're looking to stop a deck whose whole purpose is to get to 6 and up mana in order to win. Like, it might fumble them up, like it might stop them, but like it doesn't stop a clever player.
Mm-hmm.
And I would rather just have a spell that says, no, your spell's countered.
I fully agree with that.
And then,
we talked about this a little bit last week during the set review.
Yeah. And for Dispel, I think is just too narrow. To only hit instance, that includes all interaction and ad nauseum. But I don't think that's good enough in a metagame that is transforming more and more into a creature-based metagame.
Yeah. In
which a lot of spells that win the game are sorceries in the form of like things like Finale of Devastation or, other sorcery tutors. Your sorcery speed tutors who get you your game-winning card. You need to be able to counter those tutors if you can't counter the thing that they're tutoring for. So Dispel completely misses the mark on so many spells that that win the game. Because also in order to win the game, you have to be able to stop your opponents. And just going faster than everyone else, and I can say as a turbo player, is not good enough anymore. It's really not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Although I will say I am a Spell Pierce apologist.
I am as well.
I believe that Spell Pierce is actually definitely good enough. Obviously, like
I'd say Spell Pierce over Miscast, but as a whole, I just dislike them.
No, that's a fine place to be. You'll notice that none of us picked Swan Song because, like, Swan Song, you're giving up, it's a hard counter for 3 types of things that are all relevant, right? Enchantment is relevant, sorcery is relevant, instance relevant, and what it gives up is very little. I actually like
it's also a win condition.
Also true.
That's true.
In a weird way, it can be. I actually would rather play Spell Pierce over an offer you can't refuse. Believe it or not, because I feel that what you give up with an offer you can't refuse is too high, especially considering the tight margins that a lot of these decks run on. I actually was really low on Spell Pierce and Miscast about a year ago, but the way the meta has shifted and the way that players mindsets have shifted. A lot of people are right now in the gotta go fast mindset, and they are operating on very tight margins. And because Spell Pierce can hit anything that's not a creature, oftentimes that 2 mana is going to be enough to fumble them up. Especially like it can be used very early to stop mana development. Like it can hit a mana crypt, it can hit a Soul Ring, it can hit a Underworld Breach. Whereas Miscast misses on all those. Like, yes, Miscast usually is gonna tag an Adnos or whatever, but I think, and this might be a reflection of how I typically play counterspells, I play them a little more aggressively than I think a lot of people do. And so I think Spell Pierce really works nicely for that. Whereas Offer, they get their 2 treasure. Depending on who you counter, like that could be incredibly useful for them. Like maybe you go after the wrong spell with your counter spell, because sometimes that happens. We misjudge what we're going after. And then that 2 mana allows them to unlock their next thing. And when we look at commanders in the command zone that cost 2, 3, 4 mana, like oftentimes an Offer is going to, at worst, unlock them playing one of their commanders. If they're playing a partner or playing their commander that turn or the next turn, if they are going, and they have it and they don't go off. Offer's good if you're the person playing it and you are going off that turn. But at that point, there's other things that may be going to do a better job, which then makes it weird because, like, Force of Negation is a better counterspell, right? But Force of Negation isn't free on your turn. So then you get into that weird space.
Right.
And I honestly think like Offer competes with Force of Negation more than anything else. And I would always rather have Force.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like one of the worst of the counter spells for sure. I do think that it's good enough to play. In most decks, I think specifically like in control decks where you need a density of them, I think an Offer is going to be a very hard card to cut.
I think there's an argument to be made that too many people are skimping on mana drain, and also, to be quite frank, I think negate. And
I was about to say, I was like, would just rather play
spell are playable.
I think I agree. I agree with that. I also think that memory lapse is really good. I think that delay is really good.
Remand is also reasonable. Like Remand draws you a card, replaces itself. Like
I mean, that's the thing. And so for Offer, I like an Offer you can't refuse for the specific purpose of I play Storm decks, and sometimes it's beneficial for me to counter my own spells.
Yeah, sure. And like there are decks where like Karakashima absolutely should be playing Offer. Like it's a ritual for them. Like who cares if it's counter something? It's legitimately just a ritual for them. Yeah. Versus, and if you're playing something where you feel like it's going to be useful for your own stuff, great. If you're playing a mid-range deck that is looking to try to outlast one of these fast Storm decks, like you should not be on Offer.
I don't know that I totally agree with that. I think the way you use your counter spells needs to be very. If you're going to be playing a deck that is not a turbo deck that is playing these types of counter spells, you need to get really good at knowing when and how to use them. Sure. And that is one of the things where I think if you're wanting just some clean can counter whatever problematic things, like I agree with what James is saying here. I also do think that I don't think that the drawback of an Offer, as somebody who plays the card a lot, I don't see the 2 treasures being nearly as much as a pullback as people have told me it is. Because what I have seen it, at least my use of it is it counters the thing that was about to win the game. And generally that means that it's going to the graveyard and they don't have a way of getting it back or something like that. Like very few Nas decks have ways that aren't Breach to replay an ad nauseum. So to me,
they almost all have Breach, which is of course the downside.
Sure. But like generally when you're nosing, you don't have Breach out. So it's one of those things where I think that it hits enough of the things that are, I will say it doesn't counter Breach great because of the fact that It does give them the mana to do Savine's Wreck to get it back. So there are cases where it's not good. But I think this is where I think the density conversation comes back in, where if you're playing a deck where you are going to be playing a lot of counter spells, this is a really good like third or fourth option in your counter spell suite at the one mana slot, because you need to have a good deal of 1 mana counters, I think, to be able to effectively deal with stuff.
Agreed.
But I think that it is worse than Spell Pierce, slightly better. I'd say it's about on par with Negate personally. And it's worse than Spell Pierce, better than Miscast, in my opinion. I think Miscast is not a card that I think is very playable. And everybody tells me that Breach is the best win con in the format. Thassa's Oracle isn't the best win con in the format. And so they are telling me, okay, we want to be on Miscast. Okay, why don't you want to counter the more problematic thing? Why are we only playing this really narrow?
You know what counters both of those spells?
What?
Spell Snare.
Spell Snare, yeah. I don't love Spell Snare personally, but I do think that's also another piece of 1 mana interaction that maybe I would consider before I would consider Dispel. I wish it was 2 or less. The fact that it is 2 CMC makes it really hard for me to play.
Legitimately disgusting.
It would be a very good card, but I think that's the thing that
arguably one of the best counter spells ever printed.
Yes,
2 or less.
But that's kind of my issue with Spell Snare, is that you are really like it has to be 2 CMC.
Oh yeah.
So anything. So you can't counter Dark Rituals. You can't get out in front of that. You can't stop, Smothering Tithes. You can't stop Necropotences. There's a lot of things. You can't stop Doomsdays, and we're seeing
Spell Snare is not like high on the list.
Yeah, Spell Snare I think
notably counters Thassa's Oracle and Underworld Breach.
And Dockside.
Counters Dockside too.
So it's one of those things where I think that
there's a lot of good 2 things.
There are.
Many of them creatures.
Storm decks primarily play 2 CMC things because most rituals, minus like Dark Writ or like Infernal Plunger, you're calling it, but like most rituals, most win conditions are 2 CMC.
Tainted Pact, Thassa's Oracle, Breach.
I mean, we've talked
Grape
with
Shot.
Somebody.
All right, Grape Shot. You're not really doing a whole lot.
I know.
We've talked
a lot of tutors
before. I think
exactly.
We've talked before. I think about how like Chalice on 2 is like. It's either Chalice on 2 or Chalice on 0 is like the most effective Chalice, right? Because most of the things that are going to win the game are on 2. So like I think there is
a lot of the things that remove Chalice are also on 2.
Yes.
Turns off a Braid, turns off almost all the bounce except for like Chain of Vapor.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bounce spells like Snap or Winds of Rebuke or Geist Wave or all those things. Yep.
Yeah. Unfortunately, doesn't stop Abrupt Decay, but people don't seem to be playing green these days. So maybe you should play green. But that's a whole other conversation. Moving on to the last card on our list is some lands that maybe we should think twice about. Maybe they aren't always as good as we think they are. And those 2 lands are Gemstone Caverns and Tarnished Citadel. And Tarnished Citadel is a card that I get in 5-color decks where you need to be I get it specifically in Najeela because you end up gaining more life than you're losing, right? Like Najeela, you can throw any makes 5 mana, will let you activate Najeela card into Najeela, and you can make a good argument for it, right? Tarnished Citadel outside of that. To you, Sage, what is your? You and I both have opinions on Gemstone Caverns, but you specifically had an opinion on Tarnished Citadel.
I think people lean on Tarnished Citadel for low color decks with black who want to be on Tainted Pact, and they need another land that's makes either of their two colors. And I think when you are in that situation, you are likely turbo, you are likely trying to play Adnas, you're likely ritualing, storming, doing things like that. You're probably playing a high density of artifacts so that you can accelerate your game plan. Play Glimmer Void instead of Tarnished Citadel.
Wow, that's a take. Okay. That was not the direction I thought you were going to go, for what it's worth. I thought we were going this way, and Sage went that way, and I was not ready for it.
Okay. Tarnished Citadel. So I agree that Tarnished Citadel is not as good as it once was, and that's because we have a lot more options for lands. And I do.
Glimmer Void's a little bit of a hot more take. Options.
Now, that being said, if you want to go Glimmer Void, I think there are some other options there too. So Glimmer Void, sure.
But I'm saying Glimmer Void is an underlooked at card, and when you're playing a high density of artifacts.
Yeah, like you better be playing Spire of Industry before.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was gonna.
And another option might be like Undiscovered Paradise. Because how many turns do you miss land drops? Does it really hurt you to have your land come back to your hand at the end of the turn? Maybe not. No, I think Tarnished Citadel, much like some of these other cards that we've talked about.
3
before,
fucking damage is brutal.
It's a ton. It's a remnant of an era when. Land bases were harder to build. It's like
it's from the era of Praetor's Grasp.
Yeah, we did not have a bunch of stuff that we have now. We didn't have as
full set of pathways,
battle bond lands. We didn't have pathways. We didn't have the full set of talismans now. Color fixing's a lot easier to come by. Like, play something else. If you need a land in a deck that wants Tainted Pact, play a colorless land. Play Crystal Vein. For God's sake,
Crystal Vein is so underplayed.
I love that card.
Or really anything. Thran Foundry, is that or Thran Quarry? Thran Quarry.
And,
You're right. There's so many options. I don't know that I'd go Glimmer Void, but there's so many
I don't know if Glimmer Void is on my list of cards that I would play. But I personally would play Reflecting Pool before I would play Glimmer Void. So that's kind of my take on that.
When does Glimmer Void die? That's what I need to look at.
When you have no artifacts in play at the end of turn.
No at the end of turn. Okay. Beginning of the end step. Okay. That's slightly better because I didn't know if it was a static ability if you have no artifacts.
Yeah.
This card does not exist.
I just don't think. Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into the Glimmer Void thing, but there are other good 5 mana cards. You don't need to play Tarnished Citadel.
You don't.
The other card that I think, I'm not saying don't put it in your decks. I'm saying it doesn't go in every deck, and that's Gemstone Caverns. Does not go in every single Magic deck. I think a very good example of this is a deck like my Arden Silas deck, for instance, where we're playing a long game. We're not here for we're not here for a good time. We're here for a long time. And we want to have more cards in hand than our opponents all game long. And Gemstone Caverns' slight acceleration that it gives you early in the game is not worth that proposition to then also lose having a colored land. We've just been talking about, we just spent a decent amount of time talking about how we want lands that it's so easy to color fix, and we have good lands to color fix. I don't think Gemstone Caverns coming out in maybe 10% of games is worth it being a colorless land and basically a useless card in 90% of your games. I just it's so bad. If I could, I will say this. If I could have a sideboard in Commander and sideboarding cards, depending on my seat placement, I would have it in the sideboard. I'd say that. But I think in tournaments, it's really hard to convince me that if you are a card advantage style deck, you should be playing a card that is not going to produce you color and also pulls away from your card advantage. Chromox, I think, like, is the exception to this because you get it and then you are still able to get value from it when you get it, like, down the line, right? It has more uses than Gemstone Caverns does. Just generally, I think the way it's been described to me is Gemstone Caverns is basically a Chromox, and I don't know that I think that is correct. But James, I know you're laughing.
I fundamentally disagree with nearly everything you just said.
Yes.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely with you, Callahan. Like, the Gemstones Caverns is there in order for you to propel forward your basically your position in the turn order. And you have to ask yourself, why do you want to do that? Why is that beneficial to you? Are you doing it to hold up interaction for the turn one? Or are you trying to ritual off and like play an Adnaz earlier? Like, I think if you want to play Gemstone Caverns in your deck, you have to answer the question and do it in a way that you find satisfying. Why do you need to propel your position in the game, your seat position forward, basically?
I mean, we played it in Lavinia, right? Like,
yeah, and I don't think
the deck's game plan was get Lavinia down on one, right? And so, but
I don't think most people can come up with a compelling answer for that question. And so, if you can't, don't play it because, like, the card disadvantage is very serious. Because if you throw away another land that's going to make one of the colors that you're going to make anyways, just play the fucking land on turn.
So, all right.
So James, why are we wrong?
No, straight up. I think people pitch lands to Gemstone Caverns actually way too often.
Yeah.
I think people are way too willing to pitch a land. Now, granted, if you've got like 3 land or 4 lands in your opener, like, yeah, sure, whatever. Pitch a land.
Yeah.
But why are you keeping the 4 land?
Then it's like, why are you not mulling that hand though for a better hand?
Yeah. Exactly. But I think people are far too hesitant to pitch a actual card to Gemstone, and I think they should more often because it is basically a Chromox, except it's better because Gemstone does not feed Dockside. Gemstone does not get shut off by Oof or Null Rod.
Okay.
Gemstone is way harder to destroy and disrupt, so you are going to get that mana more consistently.
You know why but here's why it's harder to destroy and disrupt. Nobody gives a crap to destroy and disrupt it because it's making colorless mana. We just talked about how Grim Monolith is bad and how it doesn't make colored mana.
Hang on a second. Grim Monolith is in a slot in your deck that is not going to be filled by something else. How many other colorless lands are you running in a deck? Most decks are running one other colorless land. They're running Ancient 2. Like, that's usually about it. Now, you did mention on the list here somewhere Emergence Zone, which, yeah, probably too many people are playing that, but that's totally aside. I think having 2 colorless lands when one of them is going to have the potential to, if it's in your opener, with 75% of the time, theoretically, potentially be a colored land, good. The other thing with Gemstone Caverns is, I agree with Sage here, is that if you don't have a compelling reason to have it and want to accelerate your turn order, then you probably don't want it.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of decks actually are going to have that compelling reason naturally, either with a low cost commander or a density of 2 mana rocks or similar 2 mana value pieces or 3 mana value pieces, even like Mystic Study or anything else. Now, that being said, I think people are bad at mulliganing. And I think that probably colors y'all's thoughts here on Gemstone Caverns, because people will keep a Gemstone Caverns hand that is bad because it has Gemstone Caverns because it's a trap. But if people are more willing to ask that question with, exactly, same thing with Fish. If people are more willing to ask the question that Sage suggested, like, what does this do to accelerate me to my next turn here, and mulligan more aggressively, just because you have a Gemstone Caverns does not mean it's a keepable hand. I think if people have that in mind, it becomes a much better card.
I agree with that.
I think it's pretty close to inexcusable to cut it. But that's just me as a Gemstone purist.
I'm not. Clarity, for what it's worth, it is in almost every deck that I play. There's very few decks that I cut it from. But I do not think it is the staple that I think people think it is. Like, I see so many people making mana bases, and this is coming from somebody who sucks at mana bases. So, like, I look at this card and I see a card that too many mana bases are built around, but don't have like anything else going on that's good, if that makes sense. Like it's in so many bad mana bases where it could make that mana base so much better by just not being there.
Sure.
And
I'm
so
going to be honest though, if Gemstone Caverns is the problem with the mana base has much bigger problems.
Yeah. and I mean, like, again, like I said, I'm not saying with every card we've talked about so far, with maybe the exception of like Wheel of Misfortune. I just think Wheel of Misfortune is bad. I think all of these cards have places where they exist and make sense. I just, again, like a lot of my reasoning for cards that I've put onto this is to challenge core beliefs that we have about what is good in the format. And something that I've always believed in is because for a really long time, everybody told me, oh, well, equipment isn't really good in EDH or in cEDH. And well, turns out actually they're pretty good. Turns out Umezawa's Jite is still good.
It's cracked
Still
all the time.
Card.
It's never not good. So it's just one of those things where I look at there's a lot of things, and like you said, that are vestigial pieces from ancient cEDH. And I think trying to lose some of that is very important.
And some of the thing with a lot of these cards, like thinking specifically like Rule of Laws and Gemstone Caverns and even like the 1-mana counter spells, a lot of the problem with some of these cards is that they're also just incredibly skill testing cards in ways you don't think of. Right. Like Rule of Laws are very good, but they require a high level of skill from the entire player for them to actually be that, or from the entire table for them to actually be that good. Gemstone Caverns is a very good card, but it requires you to be incredibly skilled to actually like get the value out of it. Because not only do you have to decide, all right, is this hand keepable? What card do I pitch to it? But that what card do you pitch then requires assessing the immediate table based on seating position, based on commanders with no other information except for who has mulliganed what so far, which is incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah. And I mean, that also I should point this out, is also a product of people just don't mulligan correctly in terms of they don't do mulligan procedures correctly. Like they straight up do not mulligan correctly in how you're supposed to do it. I had this happen to me on Friday night when I was at pre-release. We're playing in a competitive event, and
all right, it's a pre-release, dude.
Well, yeah, I know that, but I've had that happen at modern events where people are just not mulliganing correctly, and I just see it happen everywhere. Happened at Silicon Dynasty. It happened at Oktoberfest. It's happened at every cEDH tournament I've ever seen in my entire life, where player 4 goes keep. And then players 1, 2, and 3 are sitting there going, well, that's good to know.
Mulligan procedure and priority procedure are two things that I think are very integral to understanding the game in a competitive way that are incredibly poorly educated on by judges at events, whether it's 1v1 or pre-releases or FNM or cEDH events, EDH events, whatever. And it becomes more of a problem for EDH because you then multiply the factor by 2. You go from 2 players to 4 players, and it becomes even messier. And that's a thing that probably, if judges are not already making these announcements at the start of EDH and cEDH events, they really probably want to start having a clear policy about mulligan and priority procedures that they make abundantly clear at the start of these events for players who may not be as aware of them.
Yeah. And kind of not to, here that we're at the end, I do want to jump on this tangent because this is just something that like annoyed the hell out of me that Wizards did was at the pre-release. And I'm very glad we had the staff at my store that we did because they knew to make that announcement. Like you were saying, is in the pre-release kits, all of them had one of 3 cards, which was Gorogoro and Satoru, Slimefoot and Squee, Catilda and Lear. Those were not legal to play in the pre-release. There were several different people that I heard that was not communicated by the event organizers.
And that's a major shift from how things have been
in
which
the past.
Weirdly enough, was a major shift from how things used to be when you got
Yeah.
pre-release promo back in the day.
Yeah.
Originally, when they had the big convention style pre-releases, you got your pre-release promo and you couldn't play it. And then they moved to stores and you got your pre-release promo and you couldn't play it. And then they started seeding them and you could play it. And then they didn't seed them at all and it became a mess and it was just part of your pack. Yeah, there's been some inconsistency.
It was a huge thing where I saw on Twitter just like different account after different account of somebody being like, I got a judge called on me because Slimefoot was in my deck or because Catilda was in my deck. And like, I think Wizards should have not done that or made it clear those were allowed in the pre-release only. Because as a judge, how it has historically been is any cards that are in your pre-release kit, you can play. Any cards, and then anything that's in your deck box cannot be cards that you could theoretically play in that game, right?
Yeah. It's been that since, they've been that way since what? The second Ravnica, Return to Ravnica?
Yeah.
Is that when that started?
I mean, during the modern era of Magic, really, which I consider the modern era mostly being like from really RTR on.
Not the set, not the format.
Right, not the format.
It definitely was not the case for some of those other pre-releases.
But that's just kind of like an offshoot conversation of me being annoyed from the pre-release of having this cool Slimefoot that would have been really good in my deck that I couldn't play because reasons. But that's its own me being grumpy about how they have handled the set for some reason. But anyhow, thank you guys for joining me this week. It was glad to have you on Sage 2 weeks in a row. I love this new schedule that Sage is on, where Sage gets to actually be on the podcast.
True. I don't love being up at 5 a.m., but being on the podcast is fun.
With that being said, Sage, what do you got going on for us to promote? Because I know you're involved with Venture Maidens, you're involved with all these different things. What's going on in Sage World?
Yes. So, yes, if you're not familiar, I'm a professional Magic the Gathering and TTRPG content creator, and so I stream bi-weekly over on the Venture Maidens Twitch channel, which you can find like the Venture Maidens Twitch, YouTube, wherever podcasts are available. You can listen to me playing in and running D&D games, and you can also commission me to run one for you if you do so, please. But yeah, just follow me at Staff of Sage on Twitter to see all the stuff that I do every single week.
We need to bring back the stream we did with Claby Charles and
so much fun,
and Lenny, and Lenny. We left on a cliffhanger too. But yeah, go check out Venture Maidens and check out Staff of Sage on Twitter. James, where can people find you? Things you're shouting out right now.
Nothing really getting work done right now. I am, as always, looking at decks on the Decklist database as a manager over there, and slowly pruning things off of the cEDH subreddit because people, sometimes don't know how to behave online. But
Never.
For the most part, you can find me on Twitter at SquirrelMobMTG.
Awesome. We love you. Thank you for being a teacher. We appreciate James, the history teacher.
Waking up at 5 a.m. is a little earlier than me, but not that much.
Not that much. We really appreciate you, and glad to have you part of the Mind Sculptors. It's good to have you back on the podcast. Second episode on the podcast, third episode on the podcast.
Second as a Mind Sculptor.
Okay,
as a Sculpty boy. I've been on here, I think, a couple times before.
That's right. But yeah. Well, that about wraps things up for us, folks. Just a couple of things to remind you about. One, you can get your Mind Sculptors merch and your Could Be a Najeela card shirt today over at themindsculptors.com/shop. Definitely want to go pick those up. And you can also support us by going to patreon.com/themindsculptors. Some of our top tier patrons, I'd like to thank Adam Hamden, David Snavely, LF Cruz, Matt Boehner, Michael Levine, and my favorite name of all is Senior Coupon. Always makes me laugh. I love that name. If you too would like to support the show, like I said, head on over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors. Also, there's a link down in the description. Also, make sure that to leave a comment down below, like, subscribe, all that stuff. We'll get back to reading Apple reviews when y'all start leaving Apple reviews again. So leave Apple reviews, people. But with all that being said, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.